You clicked for the simple physics trick that saved hundreds of American B-17 bomber crews. Here it is. The secret was not where the bullet holes were. It was where they were not. October 1943. England. A flying fortress limps home on 3 good engines, aluminum torn like foil and soot smeared across its flanks. Ground crews swarm the runway, clipboards snap open, chalk marks bloom over metal like constellations. Holes in the wings, holes in the fuselage, holes almost everywhere, almost. So where do you put the armor? The answer seems obvious. You armor where you see the most holes. Except obvious was wrong. Dead wrong. That is the gateway to our story, because this is a tale about bombers, yes, but it is also about a blind spot in the human mind. A blind spot that a quiet mathematician would expose with nothing more than patience, a blackboard, and the first principles of probability. His fix took no new engines, no exotic alloys, no miracle gadget. Just physics and logic, applied in the right place. To understand how a few sheets of armor could tilt survival curves, we need to step into the problem the Air Forces thought they had solved. After brutal raids into Germany, engineers mapped damage across returning aircraft. Patterns looked consistent, fuselages peppered, wings stitched, engines and cockpits, strangely, carried far fewer scars. The brass drew the conclusion any reasonable person might. Reinforce the places that get hit the most. There was only one catch. Every extra pound slung onto a bomber stole range, speed, and bomb load. If you guessed wrong about placement, you paid twice, once in weight and again in lives. Enter the trick. A shift in where to look and why. October 14th, 1943. Black Thursday. The 8th Air Force sent 291 flying fortresses into the sky. 60 didn't come back. 17 more were written off as irreparable. Of the survivors, almost half needed heavy repairs before they could fly again. At that rate, a bomber crew's chance of surviving the required 25 missions was less than 30%. For men in olive drab climbing into those cold aluminum tubes, the math was merciless. Each raid felt like Russian roulette with 10 chambers loaded. Families back home prayed. Commanders, desperate, looked to data for salvation. That data came from the very machines that limped home, smoking and shredded. Every hole was logged, plotted, and measured by hand. Patterns repeated like clockwork. Fuselages soaked up the most punishment. Wings followed close behind, while engines and cockpits looked practically untouched. On the surface, it felt like conclusive evidence, armor where the holes are. But here's where the tension sharpened. The brass already knew armor wasn't free. A B-17 weighed over 36,000 pounds before it even carried bombs. Add too much steel, and it staggered off runways, burned fuel faster, and carried fewer explosives. They had a hard cap, 1,500 pounds of armor at most. The problem wasn't whether to armor, it was where. And in September 1943, those decisions landed in a modest Manhattan apartment painted black for secrecy. Inside, America's brightest mathematical minds huddled under the banner of the Statistical Research Group. Among them was a Hungarian refugee named Abraham Wald. Pipe smoke curling around his face, eyes narrowed on sheets of data, Wald was about to flip the entire problem on its head. The other statisticians in that Manhattan war room had already begun crunching formulas. They took the damage maps at face value, running probabilities on where to spread the extra armor. To them, the math seemed clear. If fuselages and wings were getting hit the most, that's where protection belonged. For 3 days, Wald barely spoke. He sat quietly, pipe between his teeth, eyes fixed on the same charts everyone else had studied. To his colleagues, It looked like inertia, or maybe stubbornness. Then, in a September meeting, he finally broke his silence. "You are all wrong," he said. The room went still. Wald rose, walked to the blackboard, and drew the outline of a bomber. With chalk, he shaded in the fuselage and wings, the very areas riddled with bullet holes in every report. "These planes came back," he explained. "They took this damage and survived." Then he drew another outline. This time he shaded the engines, the cockpit, the tail controls, areas that showed remarkably few hits in the data. "So, where are those holes?" he asked, "on the planes that never returned?" In that instant, the problem inverted. What everyone else had dismissed as safety was in fact the mark of fatal vulnerability. The engines looked untouched, not because they were rarely hit, but because a single hit there meant the bomber never made it home to be counted. Wald's clarity cut like a blade. Survivorship bias, he called it. The unseen skew in data that came only from those who lived long enough to be measured. In one stroke, the conversation shifted from reinforcing what could survive hits to protecting what could not. Wald didn't just offer an opinion, he backed it with numbers. If enemy fire was essentially random, then hits should scatter evenly across a bomber's surface. Yet the returning planes showed a skew, heavy scars in some places, eerily few in others. That skew wasn't luck, it was absence. The missing holes were the silent evidence of missing planes. To the Air Force, this was heresy. Major General Oliver Eccles had been ready to plate fuselages and wings, the areas screaming with holes. Now a mathematician with a thick accent was telling them to do the opposite. Armor the engines, the cockpit, the vital control lines, spots where damage barely appeared on paper. At first, the generals bristled. "You're asking us to armor places that show no damage," one protested. Wald didn't flinch. He flipped through loss reports. At Schweinfurt, dozens of bombers had fallen after engine fires. In Kiel, crews reported cockpit hits as the fatal blow. None of that showed up in the surviving aircraft data because those machines never landed to be inspected. Wald's logic was ruthless. Reinforcing the fuselage, he explained, would be like giving extra bandages to a patient who survived a scratch while ignoring the man who bled out unseen. If survival was the goal, then armor belonged where hits were rare, precisely because they were deadly. The brilliance was its simplicity. It wasn't new metal or secret weapons. It was physics and probability applied with precision. Armor the places where a single round meant catastrophe, and you'd change the odds for every crew that climbed aboard. The room shifted. Skepticism gave way to silence. Wald had turned data inside out, revealing not just what was seen, but what was fatally unseen. By October 1943, the 8th Air Force was bleeding bombers faster than factories could replace them. Losses at Schweinfurt and Regensburg had rattled even hardened commanders. Each raid meant hundreds of airmen dead, missing, or captured. Desperation left little room for pride. Wald's recommendation, unorthodox as it seemed, had to be tested. His solution was surprisingly lean. Instead of spreading armor broadly across the bomber's body, he called for about 1,200 pounds placed surgically around the engines, the cockpit glass, and along the delicate control cables that ran through the tail. It was less armor than engineers had planned, but in the right places it promised to do far more. There were challenges. Adding steel around engines meant redesigning cowlings and shifting center of gravity. Bulletproof glass in cockpits reduced visibility and added weight where pilots least wanted it. But compared to losing nearly 10% of a formation every mission, the trade-off was clear. Modification centers across England received the orders. Crews who had spent months patching holes and hammering twisted aluminum now worked around the clock, bolting on new armor kits. We'd get birds limping in full of flak holes, one technical sergeant later recalled, and the orders were always the same. Fix her enough to fly, but get Wald's armor on first. Not everyone was convinced. Pilots grumbled that their fortresses were already sluggish with bomb loads and gunners, and now engineers wanted to weigh them down further. But the first missions with modified B-17 silenced doubts fast. Losses began to dip even as targets grew deeper inside Germany. Crews came home with stories of engines hit but still alive, cockpits cracked but intact. The numbers told the story. Survival rates were climbing. The first combat tests came in November 1943. Freshly armored fortresses thundered off English runways and plunged into the flak-filled skies of Germany. Crews braced for the same slaughter they had grown grimly accustomed to. But when the bombers returned, something was different. More planes made it back. More crews limped home. By December, the numbers were undeniable. The 8th Air Force's loss rate per sortie had dropped from over 9% to just 3.5%. Missions that once meant nearly 1 in 10 bombers wouldn't return now saw 7 in 10 survive even the worst raids. It was still deadly, but survivable. And in the calculus of war, survivable meant sustainable. Pilots began to notice. First tour, every flight was Russian roulette, recalled one lieutenant. After the mods, we still got shot to pieces, but more birds limped home. You could feel the difference. Ball turret gunners who once sat exposed in glass bubbles now had armor shielding critical lines behind their heads. Pilots hit by cannon fire watched armor glass stop shrapnel inches from their eyes. Survival wasn't luck anymore. It was math, turned into steel. The Germans noticed too. Fighter pilots who had once sent fortresses tumbling with engine hits now saw their targets stagger but keep flying. Luftwaffe reports grumbled that the flying tanks were suddenly harder to kill. To inflict the same damage, they had to press closer into formation fire, and losses mounted. Within weeks, Wald's logic reshaped the air war. Instead of pulling back or slowing raids, the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into Reich territory. With survival rates improving, commanders no longer feared catastrophic crew attrition. Wald's trick, armor where the holes weren't, had turned the tide. The first combat tests came in November 1943. Freshly armored fortresses thundered off English runways and plunged into the flak-filled skies of Germany. Crews braced for the same slaughter they had grown grimly accustomed to. But when the bombers returned, something was different. More planes made it back. More crews limped home. By December, the numbers were undeniable. The 8th Air Force's loss rate per sortie had dropped from over 9% to just 3.5%. Missions that once meant nearly 1 in 10 bombers wouldn't return now saw 7 in 10 survive even the worst raids. It was still deadly, but survivable. And in the calculus of war, survivable meant sustainable. Pilots began to notice. First tour, every flight was Russian roulette, recalled one lieutenant. After the mods, we still got shot to pieces, but more birds limped home. You could feel the difference. Ball turret gunners, who once sat exposed in glass bubbles, now had armor shielding critical lines behind their heads. Pilots hit by cannon fire watched armor glass stop shrapnel inches from their eyes. Survival wasn't luck anymore. It was math, turned into steel. The Germans noticed too. Fighter pilots who had once sent fortresses tumbling with engine hits now saw their targets stagger but keep flying. Luftwaffe reports grumbled that the flying tanks were suddenly harder to kill. To inflict the same damage, they had to press closer into formation fire, and losses mounted. Within weeks, Wald's logic reshaped the air war. Instead of pulling back or slowing raids, the 8th Air Force pushed deeper into Reich territory. With survival rates improving, commanders no longer feared catastrophic crew attrition. Wald's trick, armor where the holes weren't, had turned the tide. Wald's breakthrough didn't stop at the B-17. Once commanders saw loss rates fall, they pushed his method into every corner of aviation. The modifications were extended to Liberators, Marauders, and even the new B-29 Superfortress being prepared for the Pacific. Wherever crews faced concentrated fire, Wald's principle held: protect the points where hits were rare, because rare meant fatal. The Navy quickly adapted the idea. Carrier dive bombers and torpedo planes received reinforced fuel lines and cockpit shielding. The RAF, watching American losses shrink, retrofitted their own bombers with armor configurations based on the same logic. Even the Germans, through captured intelligence, eventually learned of the change. Their response? Train pilots to target engines even more deliberately. But pressing in for such precision shots meant flying through walls of defensive fire, and Luftwaffe casualty rates rose steeply. The effect was visible not only in survival numbers, but in morale. Airmen wrote home about the new armor with relief. "Smart fellows figured out where we really need protection," one pilot told his wife in early 1944. "Makes a difference knowing someone that intelligent is looking out for us." Behind the front lines, Wald kept refining the math. He built vulnerability coefficients, calculating not just hit frequency, but how critical each component was to survival. A control cable severed in the tail might doom a crew faster than 20 bullet holes through the fuselage. His models gave commanders tools to weigh every ounce of steel with ruthless efficiency. Soon, survivorship bias analysis became standard military practice. Planners applied it to infantry casualties, naval losses, even battlefield medicine. Everywhere, the lesson was the same. Don't trust only the survivors. Ask what you're not seeing. By early 1944, the shift was undeniable. Missions that once shredded formations now bled fewer aircraft. In January, despite raids deep into Germany, bomber losses stayed under control. For commanders, this was revolutionary. Air power was no longer on the brink of collapse. It was the spearhead of the Allied offensive. General James Doolittle, newly appointed to lead the 8th Air Force, put it bluntly: "Without these survivability improvements, we would have been forced to pause, rebuild, retrain." The war in the air would have dragged on for months, maybe years. Wald's numbers gave the U.S. a margin of endurance that strategy alone couldn't provide. D-Day offered the proof. On June 6, 1944, more than 1,200 American heavy bombers roared over Normandy. They faced flak as dense as anything seen in the war, yet only 28 were lost, just 2.3%. A year earlier, such a mission would have meant 120 bombers falling from the sky. Tens of thousands of troops storming the beaches owed their cover to bombers kept alive by a mathematician's chalkboard equations. The psychological effect rippled just as strongly. Crews climbing into their fortresses no longer felt like they were rolling dice against death. They trusted that armor was placed where it mattered most. Knowing the smartest minds in America had bent mathematics to their survival gave them a quiet confidence. As one ball turret gunner put it, "Before, every mission felt like the last." After Wald, you started to believe you might actually finish your tour. What began as bullet holes on paper had reshaped the entire trajectory of the air war. Wald had shown the military that the most important data wasn't what they saw. It was what was missing. After D-Day, Wald's influence hardened into official policy. Survivorship bias was no longer just a clever trick. It became a doctrine. Every new bomber rolling out of modification centers carried armor plates where statistics said they mattered most: engines, cockpits, and control lines. By mid-1944, the Air Force had fully standardized the configuration, ensuring no crew flew without the benefit of Wald's insight. The Navy followed suit. Submarine commanders realized their own analyses suffered the same flaw. They were only hearing from boats that survived patrols. Medics saw it too. Casualty records came only from soldiers who reached aid stations, skewing treatment priorities. Wald's approach spread like wildfire, changing how every branch thought about survival. Economists and statisticians, watching from the sidelines, quickly understood that the lesson extended far beyond the battlefield. George Stiegler, who later won a Nobel Prize, recalled that it was so obvious once Abraham explained it, yet none of us had seen it. The revelation wasn't about planes, it was about perception. Humanity was prone to mistake the visible for the whole story. Wald had handed them a lens to see the unseen. The results on the front lines remained tangible. Airmen reported cases where flak shells punched into cockpit glass only to stop against newly fitted armor. Gunners lived to climb out of turrets that once would have been death traps. Engines that would have burst into flames sputtered but carried crews back across the channel. Each survival was a data point made flesh, proof that mathematics could mean the difference between a folded flag and a homecoming. In a war of steel and blood, Wald had shown that the sharpest weapon could be an equation. When the guns finally fell silent in 1945, Wald's fingerprints were everywhere. Post-war analysis of downed American bombers across Europe confirmed his insight with brutal clarity. The wrecks, scattered across fields and forests, bore the fatal hits to engines, cockpits, and control systems. The very places Wald had ordered protected were the weak points that had doomed unmodified planes. General Eisenhower later credited improved bomber survivability as essential to sustaining the Allied offensive. Without it, the air war might have dragged on far longer, bleeding crews faster than they could be replaced. Numbers from the Strategic Bombing Survey estimated that implementing Wald's recommendations even 6 months earlier could have saved 3,000 airmen. The cost of delay was measured in human lives. But the true scope of his impact stretched far past aviation. Survivorship bias became a cornerstone concept in fields from finance to medicine. Economists realized that glowing investment records often ignored the countless failed funds that had quietly vanished. Doctors discovered that treatment statistics were skewed by counting only patients who survived long enough to finish therapy. Business analysts found that copying successful companies overlooked the unseen graveyard of failures. Everywhere, Wald's lesson applied. Absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. Wald himself remained humble. In one interview, he said simply, "I applied standard statistical thinking to available data. The real heroes are the men who fly." But colleagues knew better. One remarked, "He saved more lives with mathematics than most generals saved with armies." It was a sobering truth. A refugee with a chalkboard had altered the course of a global war. For all the brilliance of his insight, the work weighed heavily on Wald. Each box of damage reports delivered to the statistical research group came stained not just with ink, but with the unspoken truth. Every missing data point meant men who never made it home. Photographs of bombers riddled with holes often bore darker marks: blood on the aluminum, shattered glass streaked red. Colleagues noticed the change. Wald's hair grayed rapidly, his eyes lined with fatigue. He carried the knowledge that every equation balanced against lives, not numbers. Yet he never stopped. He refined his memoranda, testing trade-offs between armor weight and defensive armament, even calculating the minimum plating needed to keep loss rates sustainable. It was mathematics with urgency, models built not for journals, but for men who had only a 30% chance of finishing their tours alive. When the war ended, Wald might finally have rested. Instead, he carried his methods into peace. He helped develop sequential analysis techniques for quality control, saving millions of rounds of ammunition from waste. He applied his thinking to search patterns in the Pacific, helping rescuers locate downed pilots. The same mind that saw ghosts in the data now worked to save lives in other ways. Then came the cruelest irony. In December 1950, Wald traveled to India at the government's invitation to give lectures. The aircraft carrying him and his wife struck the Nilgiri Mountains and crashed. Wald, the man who had saved countless airmen by making planes safer, died in a plane crash of his own. He was just 48. At his memorial, a colleague said, "He saw what others could not. The ghosts in the data, the missing pieces that told the real story. He saved more lives with mathematics than most generals save with armies." Though Wald never lived to see the full reach of his ideas, others carried his torch. Many of his statistical research group colleagues went on to shape U.S. defense policy, operations research, and even the space program. Survivorship bias became a term etched into the foundation of modern statistics, taught to students as one of the most elegant insights of the 20th century. The airmen who owed him their lives never forgot. In 1985, the 8th Air Force Association erected a memorial at their museum in Savannah, Georgia. Alongside plaques honoring famous generals and decorated crews stood one for a man most veterans had never met in wartime, Abraham Wald. Its inscription read, "To the mathematician who saw the unseen and saved the unreturned." Technical Sergeant Harold Smith, speaking at the dedication, put it even more simply, "Most of us never heard his name during the war, but thousands of us came home because of him. He looked at holes in metal and saw men who would live or die. That's mathematics with a soul." Today, the legacy extends far beyond museums or memorials. Finance professionals warn against fund survivorship bias when reviewing glowing investment returns. Medical researchers scrutinize trial results for hidden missing data. Even in business, analysts ask, are we copying the strategies of survivors while ignoring the silent failures? Every time someone asks what's missing from this picture, they echo Wald's question from 1943. The B-17S that once returned, riddled with holes, now sits silent in museums, armored exactly as Wald prescribed. Docents point to the plates around engines, the bulletproof glass in cockpits, the reinforced control cables. They explain how a refugee mathematician's logic saved more airmen than any single tactical innovation of the war. The brilliance of Wald's insight wasn't just in saving bombers, it was in exposing a flaw in how humans see the world. We are drawn to survivors, to what remains visible, but in doing so, we blind ourselves to the unseen, the silenced, the missing. That blindness can cost lives, fortunes, even whole nations. During the war, it meant mistaking bullet holes on aluminum for the whole story, when the real story lay with the planes that never returned. After the war, it meant understanding why medical treatments looked better than they were, why businesses copied winners without seeing the hidden failures, why investors celebrated funds that outlasted the graveyard of collapsed ones. Survivorship bias had always been there. It just took Wald to name it, and to prove that ignoring the missing could be deadly. And there is one final irony. Wald himself was a survivor of bias. He had escaped Vienna in 1938, just before the Holocaust consumed the Jewish academic community he once belonged to. Many of his colleagues perished, their work erased, their voices silenced. Only those who fled survived to contribute to science. Wald's life, his survival, represented a data point skewed by tragedy. The missing ones were never counted. That truth gave his work a haunting weight. He knew more than most that absence can speak louder than presence. That to understand reality, one must ask not only what is seen, but what is not. As one colleague reflected years later, Abraham taught us to look for who isn't in the room. The missing tell the most important part of the story. Abraham Wald never flew a bomber, never dropped a payload over enemy territory, never sat frozen at 25,000 feet under fire. Yet his equations saved more airmen than any gunner or ace. By shifting focus from the obvious to the unseen, he rewrote how wars were fought and how data is understood. The lesson endures. What you see is never the full picture. Survivors tell only part of the story. The missing, whether they are planes, people, or possibilities, often carry the truth. That's why Wald's insight still matters today, long after the bombers have gone silent. So the next time you see a success story, whether in business, medicine, or even your own life, ask the question Wald asked in 1943. What am I not seeing? The answer might change everything, and that's the simple physics trick that saved hundreds of American B-17 crews and reshaped the way we think about survival itself. If you found this story as fascinating as we did, don't forget to hit the like button. Subscribe for more deep dives into history's hidden lessons, and share your thoughts in the comments. Had you heard of survivorship bias before today? Do you see it in your own world? We'd love to hear from you, because sometimes the most important data isn't in the numbers you hold, but in the ones that never came home. Statistics may have proven Wald right, but for the crews, the proof came in moments measured in heartbeats. Staff Sergeant James Hensley, a ball turret gunner, remembered flak over Berlin in March 1944. A shell fragment punched through his turret, ricocheting into the armor plate fitted behind his head. Before the mods, that would have killed me, he recalled. Instead, I just got my bell rung. Walked away with nothing worse than a headache. Technical Sergeant Roy Vasquez, a flight engineer, told a similar story. Lost number 2 engine to flak over Frankfurt. Normally, losing an engine meant fire, bail out, maybe explode. But the armor protected the fuel lines. We came home on 3 engines. Without that, we wouldn't have made it back. Even skeptics changed their minds. Colonel Dale Smith of the 384 bomb group once scoffed, "My crews know where we get hit. We don't need some professor telling us where to put armor." But after modifications cut his group's losses by 40%, Smith admitted he had been wrong. He became an outspoken advocate for statistical analysis in planning. Meanwhile, across the lines, German fighter pilots noticed the change. Luftwaffe ace Adolf Galland wrote in his memoirs, "The Americans suddenly became harder to kill. Hits that destroyed them 6 months ago now barely slowed them. Our pilots reported that shots which should have been fatal were not bringing down bombers. German training shifted to emphasize precision engine shots, but that required pilots to close in dangerously, flying head-on into withering defensive fire. Losses mounted, not only for bombers, but for German fighters too. Wald's math wasn't just saving American lives, it was killing German strategy. When the war ended, the concept of survivorship bias marched far beyond the battlefield. Wald's colleagues carried it into economics, medicine, and business, where the unseen proved just as dangerous as in combat. In finance, analysts learned that glowing mutual fund results hid a graveyard of failures. Only the surviving funds showed up in the statistics, giving the illusion of consistent profit. Without accounting for the funds that folded, investors were misled into thinking success was the rule instead of the exception. In medicine, survivorship bias masked the truth of treatments. Doctors who judged therapies based only on patients who survived long enough to complete them ignored those who died earlier, skewing perceived effectiveness. Wald's insight reshaped clinical trials, forcing researchers to ask, who didn't survive long enough to be counted? Business strategists discovered the same blind spot, copying successful companies without examining the countless others that tried and failed led to doomed ventures. Survivorship bias taught them to look not only at the giants who made it, but also at the silent majority that didn't. Even the military carried it forward. Rand analysts used survivorship thinking in Cold War strategy, asking not just what weapons or units performed well, but which ones never survived long enough to show up in reports. The same mindset that saved bombers shaped nuclear deterrence. The deeper lesson is timeless. Survival itself shapes perception. We hear the stories of those who return, never of those silenced. Wald taught the world that absence can be as telling as presence. A docent at the 8th Air Force Museum once put it best, gesturing to a restored B-17 armored exactly as Wald prescribed. These plates aren't just steel, they're equations. They're proof that seeing what isn't there can save lives. And that is Wald's legacy, not just armor on planes, but a lens on reality itself.